My name is Claire, I'm 29 years old, and I spent most of my life being told I was lucky to have the parents I did. From the outside, everything looked perfect. My father, a respected corporate lawyer who gave to charities and sat on local boards, and my mother, a picture-perfect homemaker with an eye for social events, who seemed to float from one community function to another like she belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. We lived in a stunning brick home in the suburbs. Big oak tree out front, rose bushes in bloom, the kind of place people slowed down to admire. Neighbors thought we were the ideal family, friends envied me, teachers smiled at my last name like it meant something, but behind that polished image, I was slowly suffocating. Inside those walls, I was just a prop, something they could shape to match their story. I wasn't allowed to cry, ask questions, or fail. Every emotion I had was too much. Every interest that didn't match their vision was dismissed. I remember once telling my mother I wanted to study art. She looked at me like I'd told her I wanted to rob a bank. "We don't waste our lives on silly things," she said. That was her favorite word, waste. Any idea, any emotion, any piece of me that didn't align with their expectations, a waste. My father was worse. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. One look, one controlled sentence was enough to make you feel like a failure. The scary part was, he believed everything he did was for my own good. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something personal. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'd love to know how far these stories reach. And if you've ever felt like your value came from how quiet, perfect, or obedient you could be, if you've ever been praised for how well-behaved you are, while secretly wondering if anyone actually sees you, not the version they molded, please consider hitting subscribe, because the story I'm about to share, it's not just about pain. It's about survival, quiet strength, and what happens when the perfect daughter finally walks away. I'm not here to ruin reputations. I'm here to reclaim mine. And for the first time in my life, I'm going to tell the truth. No filters, no edits. Just me, and maybe, if you've been through something similar, you'll realize you're not alone. From the moment I could walk, everything I did was measured. Every smile, every grade, every friend I brought home, it was all judged by one question. How does this reflect on us? Not me, us. I wasn't a daughter. I was a reflection. If I laughed too loud, my mother would tighten her jaw and whisper, "Tone it down, be graceful." If I didn't win an award at school, my father would sit me down and calmly ask, "Do you want to be average?" I used to nod, thinking I'd done something wrong, thinking I could do better. That was the trap. They didn't scream, they didn't hit, they manipulated, subtle, silent, ruthless. When I started high school, things got worse. My body started changing, and suddenly, I wasn't just their daughter, I was now their brand. My mother would inspect every outfit before I left the house. Too tight, too short, too plain, try again. She'd buy me clothes she picked and told me they were gifts, but they were uniforms. Things she could approve of, show off to her friends, and say, "Claire has such elegant taste." It wasn't my taste, it was hers. She didn't care if I liked it, she cared if it made her look like the perfect mom. And my father? He never said a word about my appearance, but if I wore something he didn't like, he'd stop talking to me for hours. The silence was worse than yelling. You start thinking you're invisible, or worse, disposable. By the time I turned 16, I'd mastered the art of performing. I smiled when I needed to. I said thank you when I didn't mean it. I played the role. I was top of my class, volunteered at the shelter, joined the debate team, and dated the boy they approved of. A pre-med kid from a good family. He was polite, clean-cut, and emotionally empty, just like them. I didn't even like him, but he made them proud, so I kept playing the game. I kept showing up to dinners, smiling through the fake conversations, pretending I was happy. But inside, I was disappearing. It was around that age I started writing in secret, journals hidden in my closet, pages and pages of thoughts I could never say out loud. I wasn't plotting revenge, not yet. I was just trying to survive, to remember who I really was under all the layers they forced on me. My handwriting would get shaky sometimes, especially after one of my mother's passive-aggressive talks, the kind where she reminded me how lucky I was to be in this family. Other girls would kill for your life, she'd say, sipping tea like she wasn't casually dismissing my entire existence. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means pressure. And pressure builds, slowly, quietly, until one day it breaks. And they never saw it coming. College was supposed to be my escape. I got accepted into a university 3 states away, and for a brief moment, I felt like I could finally breathe. But even freedom came with strings. My father had to approve the school. My mother insisted on visiting every month to make sure I was adjusting well. They paid my tuition directly, which meant they still owned every inch of my independence. I wasn't free. I was on a longer leash. In my first semester, I tried to fit in. I tried to be the kind of student that wouldn't draw attention, just coast quietly, get good grades, and maybe eventually fade into a life that felt like mine. But even from a distance, their voices echoed in my head. Don't embarrass us. Don't fall behind. Remember who raised you. I kept my head down. I went to class. I didn't party. Didn't make many friends. I didn't know how to connect with people who had been loved unconditionally. I always felt like I was performing, even in my own skin. But something started changing in my second year. I met a professor, not someone particularly warm or close, but someone who challenged me in a way I wasn't used to. She read one of my essays and said, "This isn't your voice." I froze. No one had ever said that to me. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're smart, but I don't think you know who you are yet, and until you do, you'll always write like you're afraid of being seen." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. I kept replaying it like a song stuck on loop, and for the first time, I didn't feel angry or defensive. I felt exposed. She was right. I didn't know who I was. I knew what I was supposed to be. The polished daughter, the quiet achiever, the example of grace under pressure. But I had no idea what it felt like to make a decision without thinking, what would they think? That year, I stopped calling home as much. I stopped replying instantly to my mother's texts. I started telling small lies. I'm busy. I've got study groups. I'll call tomorrow. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. Every missed call felt like a breath of oxygen. Every unanswered text, a tiny thread of independence. I didn't know it yet, but that's when my real revenge began. The kind that doesn't make noise, the kind that comes from walking away and never explaining why. I started therapy, quietly, privately. I didn't tell anyone, especially not my parents. And in that small windowless office once a week, I started peeling back the layers. I talked about my childhood, about the dinners that felt like press conferences, about how I'd fake headaches just to avoid family events, about how I'd stare at myself in the mirror and wonder who that girl was supposed to be because I had no idea anymore. And slowly, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not rage, not outbursts, but the kind of anger that simmers, the kind that whispers, "You were never crazy, you were just silenced." That kind of anger changes everything. By the time I reached my final year of university, something inside me had shifted permanently. I still answered their calls sometimes. I still sent the obligatory happy anniversary texts. But I wasn't theirs anymore. Not in the way they thought, not in the way they counted on. The girl who used to panic at the sound of her father's voice was quietly dying, and in her place, someone stronger was beginning to take root. Someone observant, patient, strategic. I started writing letters I never sent, each one addressed to my parents, raw, unfiltered, brutal. I wrote about how it felt when my father humiliated me in front of his colleagues for mispronouncing a word at age 10. I wrote about the time my mother ignored the bruises on my legs from ballet class and told me to smile wider in the recital photos. I wrote about the nights I sat alone in my room, listening to their arguments echo through the walls while pretending I was deaf. Each letter was a form of rebellion, a release. I didn't need them to read it, I just needed to finally speak. In therapy, I began to realize something that would become the foundation of my quiet revenge. They would never apologize. Not because they didn't feel guilt. I'm not even sure they were capable of it, but because people like them don't see the damage they cause, they only see the image. And if you crack that image, even a little, you become the villain. That realization set me free. I stopped needing them to admit what they did. I stopped hoping for clarity or closure from their mouths. I began building it myself, brick by brick, without ever involving them. I chose a career they didn't approve of, social work. They wanted law school, something that would uphold the family name. I chose helping abused teens find their voices instead. It was my quiet way of breaking the cycle, and maybe in some small way giving the younger version of me the mentor she never had. They found out through a mutual family friend and called me immediately. My father's voice was cold, sharp, like it always was when he felt threatened. "What are you doing with your life, Claire? You're throwing away everything we invested in you." I didn't flinch, I just replied, "I'm doing what I believe in," and then I hung up. It was the first time in my life I ended a conversation without their permission. After that, the calls slowed, the guilt-tripping texts became more spaced out. I could tell they were losing their grip, not because I was being cruel, but because I was no longer afraid of disappointing them. That's when I knew my revenge wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be confrontational. It was going to be something much harder for them to accept. I was going to heal, loudly, visibly, without them. And that was the one thing they couldn't control. It was my mother's 60th birthday, a grand affair. They rented the largest event hall in our town, hired a professional string quartet, had a catering team flown in from New York. It was the kind of gathering where everyone who mattered, in their world at least, would attend. Judges, attorneys, politicians, socialites. My father called me 2 weeks before the event and said, "You'll be there. Wear something elegant, no surprises." I knew exactly what he meant. No slouching, no minimal makeup, no talk about what I really do. Just play the role, smile for the photos, be the daughter they raised. And I almost did. I really almost did. But the morning of the event, I sat on my bed with the dress they'd paid for laid out in front of me, and I froze. Not out of fear, out of clarity. I saw it for what it was. One more stage performance in a life full of lies. One more night of pretending I wasn't the child they emotionally abandoned. And something in me whispered, "Not this time." Though I didn't go. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't apologize. I turned off my phone and took myself to a small coastal town an hour away. I had coffee by the sea. I read a book in peace. I smiled at strangers. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't performing for anyone. Back home, the fallout was immediate. Voicemails, angry texts, even a message from one of my mother's friends. "You embarrass your entire family, Claire." My father left a final voicemail that ended with, "You've made your choice. Don't expect to be welcomed here again." And I didn't. That was the moment my silent revenge began to echo through their world. Not because I shouted, not because I exposed them publicly, but because I rejected their control. And they had no script for that. Their entire identity relied on mine being obedient. The image cracked. People noticed. Questions were asked. But I wasn't there to answer them. Instead, I went back to work, helping teenagers escape their own painful homes. I gave talks at local shelters. I told stories, not mine, but ones like mine. And every time I saw a young girl look up at me and realize she wasn't alone, I felt like I was reclaiming something, piece by piece. Revenge isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's peace they can't take credit for. A few weeks after the birthday event, I got an unexpected email from one of my mother's oldest friends. Her name was Evelyn, a sharp, well-dressed woman who used to pinch my cheeks too hard when I was a kid. The subject line just said, "I heard what happened." For a second, I thought it would be another guilt trip, another "how could you do this to your family" message. But when I opened it, the words hit me like a cold breeze. "I always suspected something was wrong in that house. I hope you're okay, and I hope you keep going." It was only 2 lines, but it cracked open a door I thought would always stay shut. One by one, other people started reaching out. People I never expected, an old teacher, a neighbor, even one of my mom's former assistants. They didn't want gossip, they just wanted to say they saw it too. They saw how I was silenced, how I was used, how something always felt off. I realized then that maybe my silence hadn't just protected my parents, maybe it had also protected their entire illusion. And now, with me quietly walking away, that illusion was unraveling. I didn't go public. I didn't post anything online or confront them in front of their circle. But the absence of my compliance, it was louder than any accusation. My mother stopped getting invited to certain luncheons. My father's firm quietly began phasing him out of big cases. No one said why, but I knew. I started getting invites too. Local podcasts, therapy panels, even an interview with a women's advocacy group. They wanted me to talk about family image and emotional neglect. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't ready to put my name next to my pain. But then I remembered every time I was told to stay quiet, to be polite, to not embarrass us. So I said yes. Not for them, for me. And for anyone who's ever looked perfect on the outside but was falling apart behind closed doors. That's when I understood something deep. My revenge wasn't about punishing them. It was about becoming someone they couldn't control anymore. And that power, that peace, it's something they'll never be able to fake. It happened at the grocery store of all places. I was picking up fruit when I heard a voice say, "Claire?" I turned and saw Mr. Harrison, my father's old law partner, a man who used to come over for Sunday brunch, pat my head like I was some prized poodle, and laugh too hard at my father's jokes. I hadn't seen him in years. His face lit up like he expected me to run into his arms with gratitude. "Your parents have been worried sick about you," he said. "You broke your mother's heart." I stayed quiet. Then he stepped closer and said something I'll never forget. "We all go through things, Claire, but family is family. You don't abandon them just because it gets a little cold." It's a little cold. That was the word he used for years of manipulation, emotional starvation, silent treatment, and pressure to be a doll instead of a daughter. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. People like him knew, maybe not the full picture, but enough. Enough to say something, enough to speak up, but they didn't. Because keeping the illusion alive was more important than protecting a child. So I looked him in the eye and said, "If you knew how cold it really was, you'd understand why I'm not frozen anymore." He looked stunned, then awkward. Then he nodded, mumbled something about seeing me around, and walked away. But that moment wasn't just awkward, it was powerful. For the first time, I didn't shrink in the face of someone who enabled my silence. I didn't get angry. I didn't explode. I stood firm in my peace. That, I think, is the kind of revenge they never expect. A quiet woman who no longer fears their judgment. Later that night, I got a call from my aunt. She said, "I heard you saw Harrison. What did you say to him? Your parents were fuming." I just smiled and said, "I told the truth." And the truth is, every time I don't flinch, every time I speak calmly instead of hiding, every time I own my life without apology, I win. Not because I hurt them, but because they lost the only version of me they could control. 2 months after the incident with Mr. Harrison, I got an email that made my hands shake. It was from the producer of a well-known podcast that specialized in family dysfunction and emotional abuse. They'd seen a clip from a small mental health panel I'd spoken at, and they wanted to feature my story. A full hour-long episode titled "Behind the Perfect Family, Claire's Truth." At first, I stared at the screen for 10 minutes straight. It felt too big, too real, too irreversible. Up to that point, everything I had shared was subtle. No names, no accusations, just quiet truths in safe spaces. But this would be out there. The world would know. My father's reputation would take a hit. My mother's curated persona would unravel. Their country club friends, their church circle, their polished lives, all of it could crumble. I closed the email and didn't touch my laptop for a week. But I couldn't shake the feeling, because deep down, I knew. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about reclaiming my voice, my story, my childhood, everything they stole in the name of appearances. So I called the producer. We talked for over an hour. And for the first time in my life, someone listened truly listened without trying to fix, deny, or silence me. She didn't care about protecting my parents. She cared about telling the truth. That night, I sat on my bed and wrote the opening line of my story. Not the one they told. Mine started with, I was raised to smile through pain, to bow before appearances, and to shrink in the name of obedience. But now I speak not to destroy, but to finally exist. The episode aired a month later. It didn't go viral. It didn't break the internet. But it reached the exact people it needed to, strangers who messaged me saying they saw themselves in my words. People who had lived in homes where love was a performance and silence was survival. And for the first time, I felt something I'd never known. Not alone. My parents didn't call me. They didn't sue. They didn't even deny it. They just got quieter. Their friends started asking questions. A few stopped inviting them places. My father's retirement came earlier than expected. My mother started skipping her charity luncheons. No one said anything directly, but the silence said enough. And in that silence, I finally heard my own voice. A thick envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address, just my name, written in my mother's delicate cursive, the kind she used on holiday cards and thank you notes. For a few seconds, I considered throwing it away, burning it, leaving it unopened just to prove I didn't care. But the truth is, I did care. Not because I needed validation, not anymore, but because some part of me still wanted to understand how two people who claimed to love me could hurt me for so long without even seeing it. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter, 6 pages. The first few lines read like a script I'd heard my whole life. We always did our best. We only wanted you to succeed. We're sorry you feel that way. And then halfway through page 2, it shifted. I know you think I was cold, but the truth is, I didn't know how to be soft. I didn't know how to love without fear. I was terrified of you making mistakes because I thought it would reflect badly on me. And that's not fair. You deserved a mother who let you be a child. I didn't know how to be that woman. I only knew how to be what everyone else expected of me. I froze. Not because it was an apology, it wasn't. Not really. But for the first time, she acknowledged something, that her behavior came from fear, not just cruelty. That her perfectionism wasn't about pride, but shame. And that, somehow, made the weight on my chest lift. Just a little. At the very end, she wrote, "You were never the problem. You were just the mirror. And I hated what I saw." That line stayed with me. Because that's exactly what I had been. A mirror. And every time I showed emotion, every time I asked for more, every time I failed to perform, I reminded her of what she never healed in herself. It didn't excuse the years of silence or the way they used love as a weapon, but it gave me a piece of clarity I didn't know I needed. I didn't reply, I didn't call, but I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of my journal, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. I used to think revenge meant destruction. Now I realize sometimes the softest revenge is being able to read the words that once would have shattered you and feel absolutely nothing. It was a rainy Tuesday when I bumped into Daniel. We were both ducking into the same cafe, soaked and annoyed, laughing at the weather. He held the door open and we recognized each other at the same time. I hadn't seen him since high school, the quiet guy who used to sketch in the margins of his notebook and sit 2 rows behind me in literature class. We'd barely spoken back then, a few glances, a couple of conversations, but there was always something in his eyes, a kind of gentleness I didn't trust when I was younger because I'd been raised to see gentleness as weakness. And we sat down for coffee. What was supposed to be 10 minutes turned into 3 hours. He told me about the art studio he'd opened in the city, how he traveled to Italy for a few years to study restoration. I told him about the nonprofit I was helping build, about my writing, about everything that had happened. Not in graphic detail, but enough that he knew I wasn't the same girl he once saw in that classroom. Then he said something that made my throat tighten. "You were always more than they let you be. I remember the day you read your poem out loud. Your voice shook, but you still finished it. I never forgot that. No one had ever said that to me. No one had remembered the little pieces of me that existed beneath the mask. Not my teachers, not my relatives, certainly not my parents. But he did. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't some perfect fairy tale reunion. It was two quiet souls who had survived very different storms, recognizing something familiar in each other. Over the next few weeks, we talked more, walked, shared stories, and one evening, as we watched the sunset from a bridge overlooking the river, he said, "You don't have to be anyone else with me." And for the first time in my life, I believed it. I didn't need Danielle to rescue me. I didn't need anyone to fix me, but his presence reminded me of something I'd forgotten. There are people who will love you softly, steadily, without expectation or control. And that kind of love, even if it doesn't last forever, is a form of healing all on its own. The envelope was thick, expensive, embossed with gold lettering. It came from the same town that once taught me to stay small and silent. The same town where my father was celebrated and my mother was adored. I almost didn't open it. But curiosity has a funny way of tugging at old wounds. Inside was an official letter from the city council. They were hosting a distinguished citizens gala in a few months, and I had been selected to receive an award. For my courage in sharing my story, for being a voice for those who couldn't speak. I laughed out loud, bitterly. These were the same people who smiled at my mother's garden parties while ignoring the bruises behind my smile. The same people who saw the signs but chose silence because my parents were powerful, respected, decent. And now they wanted to honor me, not because they cared, but because my story had gone viral, because the nonprofit I helped build was getting national attention, because the same truth they once shunned was now trendy enough to clap for. I stared at the letter for a long time. Daniel watched me from across the room, quiet, respectful. When I finally looked up, I said, "It's not real. They don't mean it." He nodded. "You don't have to go, but you can, if you go for yourself." That stayed with me. Was I strong enough to walk back into that room, the same room where I was once treated like decoration, and stand as a woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist? It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the narrative. I wrote back and accepted the invitation, not for them, not for the applause, but for every version of me. The little girl who cried herself to sleep, the teenager who bit her tongue, the young woman who thought survival meant silence. I was going back, not to be seen, but to see, to look each of them in the eye and remind them that I became everything they tried to suppress. And this time, when I stood on that stage, I wouldn't be smiling for their approval. I'd be standing in honor of every soul who ever wondered if they were enough. Because I was, and I am, and I always will be. The night of the gala came quicker than I expected. I wasn't nervous, just still. I wore a deep emerald green dress, elegant but modest, with my hair in a low bun and no jewelry. I didn't want to look flashy or intimidating. I wanted to look like myself, unapologetically whole. Daniel offered to come with me, but I said no. Not because I didn't value his support, but because I needed this moment to be mine. I needed to walk into that building without leaning on anyone, without hiding behind a man's presence. Just me, walking into the same space where my mother used to smile and dominate every room, the same space where I once felt invisible and fragile. The venue hadn't changed much. The chandelier still hung like a crystal crown above everyone's heads. The music was the same soft classical blend. The guests, still dressed in overpriced fabric, laughed at predictable jokes and kept their wine glasses full. But something had changed. Me. I was no longer a product of this environment. I was someone who had crawled out of it, bleeding but alive, and returned on my own terms. As I stepped up to the stage to accept the Courage Award given by a local mental health organization, I scanned the crowd. My mother was there, stone-faced, sitting in the second row. My father wasn't. Age had turned him into a recluse, a quiet ghost in their estate. But I could still feel him. The weight of his judgment never really leaves. It just fades into silence. When the applause quieted, I held the mic and looked around. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence build, let the room feel uncomfortable for once. Then I started. I thanked them, politely but not excessively. I made it clear I wasn't there for validation. Then I told them the truth, that for years I thought love had to be earned by obedience, that I was raised to keep secrets, to smile when I wanted to scream, and to protect the reputation of people who hurt me behind closed doors. I told them healing doesn't always mean forgiving those who never said sorry. Sometimes it just means choosing not to let their version of you be the final word. As I finished, I looked directly at my mother, not with hatred but clarity. She didn't flinch, she just blinked once and looked away. That was enough for me. I walked off the stage without lingering, no fake hugs, no networking, no pretending. I stepped out into the night, pulled off my heels, and walked barefoot to my car. And as I drove away, I didn't look back, not at the building, not at the guests, not at her, because the real revenge was never about making them suffer. It was about reclaiming my life, living fully, without their script. And that night, I did exactly that.